What happens when one moment of weakness changes the course of history forever? What if I told you that behind the golden reign of Israel's wisest king lay a story of forbidden love, devastating betrayal, and ultimate redemption? Today, we dive deep into one of the Bible's most controversial yet inspiring stories, the tale of a woman who was both victim and participant in one of the greatest scandals in biblical history. Her name was Bathsheba, and her story will challenge everything you think you know about sin, forgiveness, and God's incredible ability to transform our darkest moments into His greatest glory. This is not just another Bible story, this is a raw, honest look at human nature, divine justice, and the power of grace that can reach even the deepest valleys of shame and regret. Before the storm clouds gathered, there was sunshine. Bathsheba's life began like a beautiful dream. Picture this: a young woman, radiant with hope and love, walking down the aisle toward her beloved husband, Uriah the Hittite. This wasn't just any man. Uriah was a brave soldier in King David's mighty army, a man of honor and integrity, who looked at his bride with eyes full of pure adoration. The wedding day was everything a young woman could dream of. Friends and family surrounded them, their hearts were full of joy, and when they sealed their union with a kiss, Bathsheba felt her soul melt into his. Uriah was gentle, loving, and completely devoted to her. In his eyes, she could see reflected the same deep love she felt for him. It was the kind of love that poets write about and singers celebrate, pure, innocent, and full of promise for a beautiful future together. But as we all know, life has a way of throwing unexpected curveballs. Sometimes, the very moments when we feel most secure and happy are when danger lurks closest to our door. Bathsheba had no idea that tragedy was already weaving its web around her life, waiting for the perfect moment to strike and destroy everything she held dear. One fateful day, while Uriah was away fighting in King David's battles, Bathsheba made a decision that seemed perfectly innocent at the time. Her husband was on the battlefield, far from home, and she was alone in her house. The day was warm, and she decided to take a refreshing bath in the privacy of her own home. It was a simple, everyday activity, something any woman might do without a second thought. As she let the cool water wash over her body, lost in her own thoughts and completely unaware of any danger, she suddenly felt something, a presence, a gaze upon her. It was like an invisible force that made her skin crawl and her heart race. Slowly, fearfully, she looked up toward the palace roof, and there she saw him, King David himself, his eyes fixed on her, drinking in every detail of her naked form. Can you imagine the shock, the horror, the complete violation she must have felt in that moment? Here was the most powerful man in the kingdom, the anointed king of Israel, staring at her like a predator eyeing its prey. She wasn't just embarrassed, she was terrified. This wasn't some young man from the neighborhood who might have accidentally glimpsed her. This was the king, a man who could do whatever he wanted with absolute impunity. She quickly covered herself and rushed inside. But it was too late. The damage was done. King David had seen her, and in his eyes, she had witnessed something that made her blood run cold, the fire of desire and lust burning brightly. From that moment on, her life would never be the same again. What happened next reveals one of the darkest truths about power and how it can corrupt even the greatest of men. King David couldn't get Bathsheba out of his mind. The image of her beauty haunted him day and night, and instead of fighting these lustful thoughts, he decided to act on them. Now, one day, as Bathsheba was trying to return to her normal life and forget that terrifying encounter, she heard a commotion at her door. Her heart sank as she saw a royal messenger standing there with his imposing presence, demanding her immediate presence at the palace. She knew exactly what this meant, and she knew she had no choice but to obey. The walk to the palace felt like walking to her own execution. Every step took her further away from safety and deeper into danger. When she finally stood before King David, she could feel his lustful gaze burning into her soul. She tried to resist, she really did. She pleaded with him, reminded him that she was a married woman, that Uriah was his own loyal soldier fighting his battles. But what can a simple woman do against the desires of a king? David was smooth with his words, seductive with his promises. He wrapped her in a web of temptation that she found impossible to escape. And in a moment of weakness, surrounded by luxury and power, overwhelmed by emotions she couldn't control, Bathsheba gave in to the passion of the moment. They came together. In a whirlwind of forbidden desire, forgetting for those brief moments the consequences of their actions. But when the passion faded and reality returned, Bathsheba was left with a crushing weight of guilt and shame that threatened to destroy her completely. Weeks passed, and Bathsheba tried desperately to forget what had happened, to bury the memory deep inside her heart, and move on with her life. But our actions always have consequences, and some consequences can't be hidden or ignored. As her body began to change, as the morning sickness set in and her monthly cycle stopped, the terrible truth became undeniable: she was pregnant with King David's child. The fear that gripped her was unlike anything she had ever experienced. How could she face her husband with this news? How could she explain her betrayal? How could she raise a child that was the product of adultery and deceit? Night after night, she lay awake crying until her eyes were swollen and her pillow was soaked with tears. She felt completely alone, abandoned by everyone and everything she had once trusted. The shame ate at her like a cancer, growing stronger every day as her belly began to show the evidence of her sin. But the worst part was thinking about Uriah, her faithful, loving husband, who was out there risking his life for king and country, completely unaware that his wife had betrayed him in the worst possible way. Every day that passed made her feel more trapped, more desperate, more terrified of what would happen when the truth finally came out. When Bathsheba finally gathered the courage to tell King David about her pregnancy, she saw the same fear and panic in his eyes that she felt in her own heart. They both knew that if this scandal became public, it would destroy not just their lives, but potentially the entire kingdom. David's reputation as God's anointed king would be shattered, and Bathsheba would face public disgrace and possibly even death. In his desperation, David came up with what seemed like a clever plan. He would bring Uriah back from the battlefield and encourage him to spend the night with his wife. If Uriah slept with Bathsheba, they could claim the baby was his, and no one would ever know about their affair. But Uriah's response to David's suggestion revealed the kind of man he truly was: noble, honorable, and completely devoted to his duty. He refused to enjoy the pleasures of married life while his fellow soldiers were still camping in the field, far from their own wives and families. Instead of coming into the house, he slept on the threshold, showing a level of integrity and sacrifice. When David's plan failed, when it became clear that Uriah would not unknowingly provide cover for their sin, the king made a decision that revealed just how far he had fallen from grace. In an act of cowardice and desperation that would haunt him for the rest of his life, David ordered that Uriah be placed on the front lines of the fiercest battle, essentially signing his death warrant. If at all Bathsheba learned of this plan, she would have felt her world completely collapse. The man she had given her body to, the father of the child growing inside her, was now planning to murder her innocent husband to cover up their crime. The betrayal was so deep, so complete, that she could barely comprehend it. Then the news finally came that Uriah had been killed in battle. Bathsheba felt like a part of her soul died with him. The pain was indescribable, a fire that burned inside her, consuming every trace of happiness and hope she had ever known. She mourned not just for the husband she had lost, but for the man she had betrayed, for the love she had thrown away, and for the innocent life that had been sacrificed. To cover up their sin, in the midst of her grief and despair, King David came to her with an offer that felt more like a trap than a blessing. He asked her to become his wife, to join his household and raise their child as a legitimate heir to the throne. Bathsheba found herself caught between impossible choices. On one hand, marrying the man who had orchestrated her husband's death felt like the ultimate betrayal of Uriah's memory. But on the other hand, she was pregnant and alone in a society that showed no mercy to unwed mothers. Without David's protection, both she and her child would face poverty, disgrace, and possibly death. With a heavy heart and no real alternatives, she accepted his proposal. As David's wife, she tried to find some peace, some way to build a life from the ashes of her former happiness. But every day must have been a struggle, every moment a reminder of what she had lost and what she had become. She felt like she was living someone else's life, trapped in a palace that felt more like a prison. The only thing that gave her any hope at all was the life growing inside her unborn child, who represented the one pure thing to come from all this darkness and pain. When her son was finally born, Bathsheba must have experienced a brief moment of pure joy. Holding her baby in her arms, looking into his innocent face, she felt a love so powerful it seemed to wash away all the pain and guilt, at least for a moment. This was her child, her precious boy, and nothing else mattered, but their happiness was short-lived. Within days of his birth, the baby became seriously ill. He wouldn't eat, he cried constantly, and his tiny body burned with fever. Despite all their efforts, all their prayers, all their desperate attempts to save him, his condition only got worse. Bathsheba may have spent sleepless nights by his bedside, holding his tiny hand, begging God to spare his life. She prayed like she had never prayed before, maybe even offering her own life in exchange for his, promising to do anything if only God would heal her son. David joined her in prayer and fasting, humbling himself before God, pleading for mercy. But sometimes our prayers don't receive the answers we desperately want. After 7 days of agony, of hope, followed by despair, of fighting for every breath, Bathsheba's precious baby boy died. The pain was beyond description. It felt like her heart had been ripped from her chest, like her very soul was being torn apart. She held his lifeless body against her chest, refusing to let go, singing softly to him, begging him to come back to her. How could God take away the only pure and beautiful thing in her life? How could an innocent baby pay the price for his parents' sins? In the weeks and months that followed her son's death, Bathsheba struggled to find any reason to keep living. The grief may have been overwhelming, the guilt crushing, and she feeling completely abandoned by God and man. But slowly, very slowly, she began to see glimpses of hope. David, who had been her partner in sin, began to show her a side of himself she had never seen before. He comforted her with genuine tenderness, spoke to her about God's mercy and love, and helped her begin to heal from the wounds in her heart. For the first time since their affair began, she saw in him not just a king or a lover, but a man who was also struggling with his own guilt and seeking redemption. And then, like a miracle emerging from the deepest darkness, Bathsheba discovered she was pregnant again. At first, maybe she was terrified that history would repeat itself, that this child too would be taken from her as punishment for her sins. But maybe David assured her that this pregnancy was different, this was God's sign of forgiveness, his promise of a second chance. As her belly grew with new life, so did the hope in her heart. Every movement of the baby inside her was a reminder that God had not abandoned them, that even in the midst of judgment, his mercy was still available. She began to dream again, to imagine a future filled with love and joy instead of pain and regret. Then the baby was born, and they named their son Solomon, which means peace, because after all the storms and trials, God had finally given them peace. This child was their second chance, their proof that God's love is stronger than our failures and his grace is more powerful than our sins. But as King David grew older and his health began to fail, questions about who would succeed him on the throne became more urgent. David had many sons, and not all of them were content to wait for his natural death. Adonijah, one of David's older sons, began making moves to claim the throne for himself, gathering supporters and preparing to declare himself king. When Bathsheba learned of Adonijah's plans, she was filled with fear for Solomon's life. She knew that if Adonijah became king, he would see Solomon as a threat and would likely have him killed to secure his own position. Everything she had suffered, all the pain and loss she had endured, would be meaningless if her son was murdered by his own half-brother. Drawing on Rasa, the ease of courage she didn't know she possessed, Bathsheba went to David and reminded him of his promise that Solomon would be his successor. She spoke with passion and determination, fighting not just for her son's future, but for the destiny she believed God had planned for him. David listened to her plea and immediately took action. He ordered that Solomon be anointed as king of Israel, fulfilling the promise he had made and ensuring that his chosen successor would take the throne. When Bathsheba watched her son being crowned, when she heard the people shouting, "Long live King Solomon," she felt a deep satisfaction, knowing that all her struggles had led to this moment of triumph as King Solomon took his place on the throne. Bathsheba found herself in a position she could never have imagined when she was a young bride, married to Uriah. She became the queen mother, one of the most powerful and respected women in the kingdom. Solomon showed her tremendous honor, even rising from his throne to bow to her and offering her the seat at his right hand. But this wasn't just about political power or royal protocol. The relationship between Bathsheba and Solomon was built on genuine love, mutual respect, and shared understanding of how God had worked through their lives. Together, they worked to build a kingdom based on wisdom, justice, and faithfulness. to God. Under Solomon's rule, Israel experienced its greatest period of prosperity and peace. He became known throughout the world for his wisdom, and people traveled from distant lands just to hear him speak. The kingdom grew strong and wealthy, and the people lived in security and happiness as Bathsheba watched her son's reign unfold. As she saw him become the great king she had always believed he was destined to be, she understood that every painful step of her journey had been necessary to bring about God's ultimate plan. Her sin had led to tragedy, but God had used even her failures to accomplish his purposes. Looking back on her life, Bathsheba could see how God had woven together all the threads of her story, the good and the bad, the sinful and the redeemed, into a tapestry that revealed his incredible grace and power. She had been a victim of a powerful man's lust, but she had also been a willing participant in adultery. She had experienced devastating loss, but she had also received incredible blessings. Her story teaches us that no sin is too great for God's forgiveness, no failure too complete for his redemption. It shows us that even when we make terrible choices that hurt innocent people, God can still use our lives for his glory. It reminds us that his mercy is new every morning, and his love never fails. Bathsheba's journey from shame to honor, from victim to queen mother, from sinner to saint, is proof that God specializes in taking our mess and turning it into his message. Her life demonstrates that it's not how we start that matters, but how we finish. It's not about being perfect, but about being forgiven. Through all the pain and joy, the tragedy and triumph, the sin and redemption, Bathsheba learned that God's grace is sufficient for every situation. She discovered that his love is stronger than our failures, his mercy is deeper than our sins, and his plans for us are always good, even when we can't see how he's working. And that's the incredible story of Bathsheba, a woman who experienced the deepest valleys of human failure and the highest peaks of divine grace. Her life reminds us that no matter what we've done, no matter how far we've fallen, God's love and forgiveness are always available to us. If this story has touched your heart, if it's given you hope or challenged you to think differently about God's grace, I'd love to hear from you. Please take a moment to like this video. It really helps spread these powerful stories to more people who need to hear them. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more inspiring biblical stories that will encourage your faith and strengthen your walk with God. Most importantly, I want you to leave a comment below. Tell us how this story has impacted you. Share your own experiences of God's grace in your life. Let us know which biblical character you'd like to hear about next. Your engagement helps build a community of believers who support and encourage each other through these timeless stories of faith, redemption, and hope. Remember, no matter what your story looks like right now, God isn't finished writing it yet. Just like he did with Bathsheba, he can take your pain and turn it into purpose, your mess into a message, and your test into a testimony. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.